So the problem with this is it's that tuck under of the hips, sometimes called a butt wink, that rounding of the lumbar spine at the bottom of the squat. Now, neutral spine is super important in the movements that we do. It's one of the tenets of movement quality, having a good stable base from which to generate force and power. Basically, neutral spine is when your spine, that S-shaped spine, and your pelvis sitting on the bottom are wed together. So if you imagine we draw a rectangle around that S-shaped spine and your pelvis, and everything moves together. Now, it doesn't mean it has to stay vertical. Obviously, when you squat, it will move. When you deadlift or hinge at the hips, it will move. But what's inside that box, inside that rectangle, should stay the same. The issue when you have a posterior pelvic tilt, when your hips tuck under, is that instead of your pelvis being wed to your spine and then moving as one solid structure, this box becomes smaller. It's no longer encapsulating your pelvis, and now the pelvis is wed to the femur. So your femur, your thigh bone, and your pelvis move together, and then the spine moves independently. And what that means is that you're then getting a rounding of your lumbar spine. You're flexing forward, which can lead to long-term disc degeneration, loss of power, and other lower back injuries, which we want to avoid. So that's the issue. 5 points I want to cover here. So 5 things that we need to address in trying to correct this problem. First, is it a technique issue? This should always be our first port of call, because if you can coach someone out of incorrect movement, bang, it's an easy fix. You've got a magic wand there. So it could be a technique issue. Now, it's a technique issue if when you squat, your knees are falling in and your femurs are coming in too narrow. So your legs are coming in too narrow rather than tracking out a little bit. And the reason behind that is when you bend your leg up to the front, what happens is your femur will come up and it will hit the front of your pelvis. And that solid contact, that bone-to-bone contact there, something has to give. And what gives is that the pelvis is then pushed by the femur into a posterior pelvic tilt. So how do we address that? How do we fix it? Well, the knees need to be tracking out a little bit more, but don't do that by focusing on the knees, because that's just a symptom. We need to do that by focusing on generating some torque. So when you squat, screw your feet into the ground. That will naturally get your knees tracking where we want. And then instead of your femur coming up and hitting the front of your pelvis, the anterior superior iliac spine of your pelvis, and causing it to posteriorly rotate, you'll then be outside that and you can get full movement without any impingement on the front of the hip or any posterior pelvic tilt on the pelvis. So that's the first thing, a technique issue. Second thing, is there a structural issue? So basically this comes down to a genetic predisposition towards a certain shape in the joint. So 3 things here. It's the depth of the acetabulum, which is the socket that your femur slots into. It's the angle that acetabulum, that socket, is at. And then it's the angle of the neck of your femur, of your thigh bone. Those 3 things cannot be changed. They are how they are. So although this can be an issue and it can make it very difficult for some people to squat without losing that neutral spine, it's stuff that we just have to work around. It will be difficult. It's not something that we can address. So we can go to some other things. The third thing is the joint capsule. So if you have tightness through your joint capsule, it is a passive tissue. It doesn't contract and create movement, but it's there to add a little bit more support to a joint. So instead of the femur just sitting in a socket like this, that capsule surrounds it a little bit to keep it a little bit more stable. Now, what can sometimes happen is you can have a tightness through that joint capsule, and we need to actually move the femur, the thigh bone, around inside that socket. Now, if that's the case, what we need is some sort of distraction, which is basically where you're moving the thigh bone in that socket. I won't go into full details on exactly what that looks like, but basically you're looking to take the hip to 90 degrees, the knee to 90 degrees, so we're emulating the positions that you would see in a squat, and then you're looking to pull that femur in the socket, in the acetabulum, and you can do that with a band. For example, lying on your back with the band around the upper thigh, attached away from you. So it's pulling that femur back in the socket. May give you a little bit more movement. You can also work on internal and external rotation of the hip, again with those 2 90-degree angles, which should also help to create a little bit more movement through that hip capsule. The fourth issue, flexibility. Now, normally people go straight to, well, your hamstrings are tight. And you can see why they say that, because the hamstrings play a role in posteriorly tilting the pelvis. So if your hamstrings create that tilt in the pelvis, surely too much tightness through the hamstrings is going to create that tilt. And while that's the case, you've got to look at this in the context of a squat. So when someone is squatting, yes, their hamstrings are being lengthened over the hip, but because their knee is bending and because the hamstring runs over both the hip and the knee, which is referred to as a biarticulate muscle, bi2 articulate joint, runs over two joints, your hamstring is being tightened over the hip by going into hip flexion, but it's also being released over the knee because you're going into knee flexion. So any increase in tightness that you get at the hip is completely cancelled out by the knee, so probably not the issue. There is some research or some schools of thought talking about the roles of ankle flexibility, in particular the ankle dorsiflexion in the hamstrings. A good article you can have a read over on the ROM website. Hit me up if you want to have a look at that. But basically, that ankle position, if you're able to get more ankle dorsiflexion, the knee can track further forward, which shifts the hip forward, which creates a more vertical torso, which is going to be more conducive to a neutral spine. Finally, the fifth thing, and I think this is probably the lowest hanging fruit other than fixing technique through good coaching, and this is a motor control issue. So a lot of the time people just don't know how to keep their body in the correct position. A few things we can do to fix this. Firstly, you need to get some instant feedback. If you're trying to create any change to your motor control, to your ability to control positions, you need to get instant feedback for that to work. In terms of the actual drills and exercises you can do, if you sit down on a box that would be maybe at parallel, as if you're doing like a box squat, but other than that, everything in the same position as you would be in for a squat. Sit on that box and see if you can get into a neutral pelvic position. If you can, it tells you it's not a flexibility issue, and yes, it is motor control. And then when your muscles are turning off, you're able to get in good position there. So find the lowest box at which you can sit while keeping your pelvis neutral and not getting that posterior pelvic tilt. Once you've done that, you can then hover slightly up off the box, holding that position. You'll find your hip flexors have to work very hard to keep the pelvis tilted anteriorly. It's not actually tilting it anteriorly, it's keeping it neutral, but your hip flexors are going to resist that posterior pelvic tilt. So the motor control is your ability to activate those hip flexors, your rec fem, your psoas, those sort of muscles through the anterior hip. So you can hover just off that box and maintain it to teach your brain to do that. And then you can stand all the way up. You can do slow lowers, all the while keeping the pelvis neutral. Then you can start to reduce the height of the box. You can start to add some weight, like a goblet squat with a kettlebell or a dumbbell held in front of you. You can then transfer that to a barbell, still coming off the box. You can then transfer it to a back squat, even an overhead squat, all the time working on that good motor control and keeping the spine neutral as you go. This is the best way to teach you where neutral is. Once you know where it is, you can activate the correct muscles. Once you activate the correct muscles, you'll be resisting that posterior pelvic tilt and you will be staying neutral and looking after the back.